Hello and welcome to the 44th edition of Half Hour, a podcast starring me, John Paulo Giudice, as your host. In today's episode, I will discuss Caribbean issues with Sir Ronald Sanders. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you'd like to begin by telling the audience, a little about maybe your background and what got you into, being an ambassador for this island country in the Caribbean.
Well, I started my working career as a broadcast journalist with the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC's World Service in London. I'm originally from the Caribbean, and I went back to the Caribbean in my early 20s, took my broadcasting experience with me, and in a very few short years I had ascended to the top of that career and was pretty well-known broadcast journalist throughout the Caribbean, dealing with international issues, hemispheric issues, and regional issues that affected the lives of the people of the region. And I became, at that point, an advocate for the cause of small developing countries. Eventually, I was headhunted into diplomacy, and I've spent my life since 1982 until now in and out of diplomacy as an ambassador in many theaters of the world, starting my career in the United Nations, working through several of the UN bodies in Europe and being ambassador to Britain and elsewhere. And now here in the United States, I'm the ambassador here, but I also have responsibility for Canada. And I hop between Washington and Canada on a regular basis. But my entire role in these ambassadorial positions was an extension of what I was doing before, which is to be an advocate for Caribbean causes, but instead of reporting for them, I am now participating. I now have a seat at the table in which I can negotiate with others in the interests of the region. And that's what I've been doing from 1982 until now, except for brief periods from time to time when I've moved into the private sector. In the private sector, I've worked for a large American telecommunications company as a negotiator and in charge of acquisitions. And I've also worked for Bank of New York, Intermaritime Bank of Geneva in Switzerland, giving advice on investments in Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. So I've had a kind of mixed life of broadcast journalism, diplomacy, business. I've also served as an academic. I've been a visiting fellow at the University of London and at the University of Toronto at Massey College. So I've lectured, I've written books, I've written parts of books, I've written chapters, and I am now doing a syndicated column, which I've been doing for 12 years now, the column is syndicated throughout the Caribbean, but it also goes out internationally on internet news portals. And those columns deal with many things, including climate change, political positions in the world. I did a lot of writing on the United States presidential elections and on racism, on reparations for slavery, on a number of items of that kind that affect the Caribbean one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a common legacy of this region and in the United States, even in places like Brazil. A lot of the Atlantic slave trade went through these places. But I was really interested in talking about your book. I have it here. Looks like a very interesting read. If you want to tell the audience a little bit about your book and Crumbled Small, the Commonwealth, Caribbean, and world politics, what would you say is the main, if you want to shed some light, for the audience on kind of like the overall of what the book is about?
Well, let me start by saying this. People in the United States maybe take it for granted now, but when this country was made up of colonies of Britain in the Americas, and they each governed themselves except for the dictation that they had from the British Crown and from the British Parliament, they were all separate states. So the 13 colonies that initiated the United States of America were very separate places with their own governments, their own local governments, most reluctant to part with the authority that they exercised, and the only thing that made them in the end join together as the United States of America was a common enemy. They saw themselves being recolonized by Britain, which had a superior naval force and an army well accustomed to war, and they were not. But they knew one thing, and that is that if each of them tried to resist Britain, they wouldn't succeed. It was only as a collective of the 13 states, with a combined power of all of them, could they possibly succeed. Now, that should have been a lesson to many countries of the world, that small places cannot survive on their own, that there is strength in unity, and therefore it is necessary to pool the resources of the small in order to survive against the bully and the big in the world. And the United States experiment of independence was a great inspiration to many other parts of the world. But unfortunately, it was an inspiration in separation, in that the countries that pursued the American dream of independence didn't try to do it collectively. They all went ahead to do it independently, separately, except in the Caribbean, where in 1958, 10 countries of the Caribbean attempted to set up a federal government, much like you have in the United States now, that would contest with the British for independence. Not in a violent way, not with the use of troops and all of that, but by negotiating for their independence. Well, they tried that, but unfortunately, the lure of separatism is far greater when you don't have a common enemy, as the 13 states of the United States had.
Yeah.
The lure of nationalism is far greater than the attraction of a federation, because nationalism means you have full authority. In a federal situation, you have to relinquish some sovereignty to the whole. Not all countries are willing to do that, because their governments, once they have a taste of power, don't want to release it. And that was the tragedy of the West Indian Federation, which only lasted between 1958 and 1962, when it collapsed on the basis of nationalist fervor in one country, that's Jamaica. And Jamaica's departure from the West Indian Federation led a Caribbean scholar and historian, Dr. Eric Williams, who was then the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, to come up with the very clever mathematical equation that 1 from 10 leaves naught. And he therefore figured the West Indian Federation was over, with Jamaica departing, and so did Trinidad and Tobago too, which left the smaller islands floundering, and unfortunately each of them proceeded to independence on their own. But the problem about being small is that the small are usually the first victims of the bully. They're not usually the last, but they are the first. And the small are the first to feel everything. So that, for instance, climate change, to which the small countries produce very little in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, which is what causes climate change. Small countries all throughout the world, all of them collectively, do not produce 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Yet these countries are the biggest victims of climate change. In the Caribbean, for instance, they suffer hurricanes year after year, sometimes multiple hurricanes that decimate the country. It takes only one hurricane to destroy an island in the Caribbean. A hurricane that comes to Florida or Atlanta does not destroy the United States, but it destroys an entire country in the Caribbean. So you could see the difference of what I mean. But there are other things. Because you are small, you're not strong enough, you have no military might, you have no economic clout, you cannot resist what bigger countries and indeed international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and others do to you, because you don't have any power, either militarily or economically. So these countries have become disadvantaged over time. And my role, as I've seen it in my life, is to fight for the interests of those countries, and that's what I've been doing. Now, what that book, Crumble Small, says is that when empires crumble, as the British Empire crumbled, they tend to crumble exceedingly small. So that the British Empire crumbled, it was all over the Caribbean, and then when it disappeared from the Caribbean, instead of one big, large British Empire in the region,
Small
ended up with
states.
small little states, each of them incapable of looking after themselves in the full sense of that word. Now, what is remarkable is which is the country that made that mistake more laterally, and that country is Britain itself. When the empire was reduced just to the island state of Britain and a handful of territories around the world, Britain chose to leave the European Union by what is now famously called Brexit, Britain exiting Europe. But in doing that, Britain reduced itself to a small island state. It's no longer a country with an empire. It's no longer a part of the larger European Union. It's just a tiny little island. And Britain is fast learning the consequences of being small.
Yeah.
Because it is losing its clout in the world to trade, to make great trade deals, or to win big contracts. All of that is disappearing. And eventually, I suspect Britain won't even have a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, because the European Union, which is made up of a larger number of countries in Europe, will say if there's any place that deserves a seat on the United Nations, it's us, not Britain, because Britain is becoming increasingly irrelevant to the world's troubles and its affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was doing some reading about how the British are now looking almost like for a new direction, kind of. How do they replace, this single market and this kind of political and economic institution that they left? I was doing some reading about how they're seeking more partnerships with Canada, with Australia, or they're looking into it. But I think you're right when you say they're fast learning kind of the consequences of being small. And what you were saying about the Security Council reminds me of how there are, you have Britain and France both in the security role there, but the EU, saying that they want a seat. I could imagine that almost kind of coming, from the French situation, being like a major player in the EU. But what I can also see is potentially, either the British lose their status, or they keep it and they add more countries to the security fold, the Permanent Security Council. It's going to be a very interesting, track to see what ends up happening with that.
Well, I don't see Britain continuing to be on the Security Council of the United Nations with a veto power, which is what they now exercise, along with 4 other countries: Russia, China, the United States of America, and France. France does not deserve a veto power. It's also a small state in Europe. Europe collectively deserves a seat on the Security Council, because they represent so many countries of such considerable size, including Germany. But France by itself and Britain by itself certainly ought not to be in that position anymore. And then you have to ask yourself, why does Africa not have a seat on?
Right, it just seems outdated. I agree. I raised this point in one of my courses in college. We discussed, the course name was Economic Integration of the EU, but we kind of went into a different topic one day about, the EU's place in the world, and kind of like what they've been up to. And I kind of made the point that there are so many large countries that it would seem like their time for leadership has come, whether that be India, maybe a collection of African states. I know that there's, if you're talking about countries being small, I know that in East Africa they're trying to form some sort of federation. I'm not sure if it's a, full federation or if it's more of a monetary union. Or an economic union of a sort. They're calling it the East African Federation with Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. I think there's a few other states that are interested in joining. But from where we've gone in this discussion, I think it really does seem like collections of states with common values and a single market can really make either a difference in the world or kind of hold their own. Because
absolutely.
When you have these smaller states, it becomes ever more difficult. I know before we started recording, we talked a little bit about Haiti and how that's one of the Caribbean's. This country is undergoing some massive instability, and they have been for some time, but recently it's gotten a little worse. I just wanted to hear more about your thoughts on that. Of course, after what you were going to say.
Yeah. Well, Haiti is a country of 11 million people living in Haiti.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
The Haitian diaspora is probably half that size, distributed around the world, in France, in parts of Europe, in the United States, and Canada. And yet, that country has, from the time of its war of independence against France, been, in a sense, blighted. Its blight started with that revolution of the slaves who said to the French imperialists and colonists, enough, we are not going to stand anymore the cruelties and barbarity that we've suffered at your hands. You've become rich at the expense of our blood. And they had a rebellion, which they won. But the French joined with the United States of America at that time. The United States was terrified by that rebellion in Haiti that led to the overturn of the French government, because at that time the southern states of the United States was run on slave labor, and the fact that slavery could be overturned in Haiti sent a very sharp signal to them about what would happen with their wealth if the slaves in the south of the United States were to rebel in the same way and succeed. Because you would have ended up with a situation, if that had succeeded, where the white settlers in the south would either have run to the north or stayed to fight with the slaves in the south. If nobody had come to their aid, unquestionably the slaves would have won because they outnumbered the whites.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it terrified them, but that's why the United States joined France in trying to squeeze this nascent Republic of Haiti into submission. And what was the first thing they did? The French extracted a tithe from this new republic, demanding compensation for what property they had owned, including slaves.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the slaves on Haiti agreed to pay it. They never stopped paying it until 1950 something. So you imagine that over almost 200 years of paying France money every year, which
awful.
They didn't have. They therefore deprived themselves of that earning in order to pay France. And in doing so, they neglected other things, educating their people, health facilities for their people, building infrastructure, roads, bridges, all the things that Haiti would have required. So the population was left largely illiterate. People were left largely without medical facilities. So they were hurt from the beginning. And then, in order to survive, they chopped down trees. They needed the wood for fuel, for cooking, for various things. And in chopping down those trees, they they created is one disaster after another.
Mm-hmm.
Because when the rains came, there was nothing to keep the sides of hills and mountains from flowing down into the valleys because there were no more trees there. And so they drowned, and the place became prone to one disaster after another. And then extreme poverty developed. Extreme poverty to the point where nobody who came into Haiti as a government had any capacity for dealing with that poverty in a constructive way. So they chose to impose their will, impose the will of the government on the people. And we had a succession of dictatorships in Haiti. We also had a succession of very corrupt leaders who robbed the country of its money, made it even more impoverished than it was. And that's the Haiti we see today. So what were Haitians to do? Like every other people in the world who want a better quality of life, they sought to get out of Haiti, move to some place where there was economic opportunity. They were no different from the migrants who moved to the United States and Canada, except that they weren't migrants. They were refugees. They were people fleeing from very difficult circumstances. And by this time, the United States didn't need any more unqualified migrants. And so they resisted the refugees, as the United States is resisting them now from Central America. So you've got this whole buildup of people trying to get into the United States on the borders of your southern border. A problem to which the United States itself contributed, incidentally, because in Haiti you went in there and occupied that place for 30 years.
Yeah, this was in the first half of the 20th century, right?
Like the 1930s.
Yeah, okay.
You went in there for 30 years, ruled the country, changed its laws, deprived the people of their land rights, and left it with a further legacy of poverty. But at the same time, why did you go in? You went in because you said Haitians who had borrowed money from American banks, money which they borrowed incidentally to pay back France, were not meeting the bill. So in trying to get the banks to be paid, you invaded the place and occupied it for 30 years. And in the course of being there, wrecked the country even more. Because the people who went in had no real interest in the people of Haiti. They only had an interest in getting the money back from the banks.
Yeah.
So Haiti has been a sorrowful place, a sorry place for a very long time. Not because of the making of the Haitians themselves, but because of all of the external factors that have influenced the way in which the place has become a nation.
And and from your explanation, it really seems like at the time, the French, the Americans, it was just one cycle of pettiness to the next. Like, oh, you have to pay us, because you were our property at the time. I think it just shows you how far the world has come. There's obviously work to be done, so much work to be done. But it shows you that, there's always kind of a direction to be had when it comes out to trying to help these smaller states kind of get back on track. And a lot of these larger states really are the ones that are responsible for the predicament, countries like Haiti find themselves in. Of course, you can't just, obviously lay all the blame on one country or a number of countries. I always felt like it's a combination of, internal and external factors that kind of lead, places to not have the influence they should. Of course, it's about their size as well. But how would you say, would you call someone from Antigua and Barbuda like Antiguan or?
Yeah, somebody from Antigua and Barbuda is what you would say, because the country is made up of 3 islands, one of which is not populated. But Barbuda and Antigua both are, and so it's a single state called Antigua and Barbuda. So the natives of the country would be Antiguans and Barbudans.
So I know you were saying earlier about how many of these, you said there were 10 remaining countries in this West Indies Federation, and then it kind of dissipated. Why did these 2 islands decide to stick together? Is it proximity, or is it more like two leaders on each island kind of agreed, or how
No.
did that?
No, in fact, if it were left to the Barbudans, I think they would secede from Antigua and go their own way.
Is Antigua the larger of the two
Yes,
islands?
yeah,
Oh,
it
okay,
is.
I see.
Not that I think Barbuda would have a snowball's chance in hell to survive on its own. It's a population of a very small number of people, 10,000 at most, but incapable of statehood, incapable of defending themselves against adventure from outside, incapable of keeping people to the standard of life to which they are accustomed, though they will tell you that they could. The truth is they couldn't. The economics of it dictate that that isn't so. But they would like to secede because they, for a long time, existed on their own. They were annexed to Antigua by an order in council of the British sovereign at the time in 1860. And even when they were annexed to Antigua, the people who ran Antigua at the time resisted it because they felt Barbuda would be a burden upon them.
I
They
see.
would have to keep the place going, which in fact is what has happened. But the Barbudans have always resented being part of Antigua. They wanted to run their own show. That's continued to this day. But the truth of the matter is that Barbuda is better off being attached to Antigua. It could not survive on its own, and I can't imagine who else it would attach itself to in order to survive in this world. They will say they don't need anybody, but that's just braggadocio and bravado because they do. They are far too small to be able to survive on their own.
What is I know the population of the country as a whole, it's around 100,000, right? What's the population difference between the two islands?
Oh, quite huge. It's more than 10 times.
Okay, so Barbuda is like 10,000, maybe smaller.
Yeah, very, very much smaller.
The
And,
city where I grew up in Massachusetts has about 50,000. So
well, there you go.
sometimes I think about it.
The entire population of Antigua and Barbuda is not a street in Brazil in terms of population size. So we talk about, you can go to towns in very small villages in the United States where the population is 100,000. So we are small, that's the point. Now, the truth is, though, that despite the smallness of the place, all of these places have survived as nations, in part because of aid, but not only because of aid. It's also because they've been creative enough to take what industries they have and make a go of them. Antigua is now one of the most popular destinations for tourism in the world, and it survives on that. Barbuda is fast becoming, and will become very shortly, one of the top 10 luxury premier destinations in the world.
Oh,
Only
okay.
the very rich will go there, because only the very rich will be able to afford to go there. It'll be a private plane, big yachts place, and it will have artificial intelligence doing all sorts of things,
Oh, wow.
including how condominiums are managed. I mean, eventually you can buy a condominium. You will be able to buy a condominium in Barbuda, in which you will have a fob, and when you land at the airport in Barbuda, you can turn on all of the electricity and water and everything in your apartment. In that condominium, you'll have a car that will pick you up and take you to your apartment. You will go into a lift, and you will come out at your apartments actually in the apartment, not even going through a door. All of that is going to be the future of that place, and it's going to be a place where only the wealthy will be able to afford to go.
Do you think that if, Antigua and Barbuda collectively, I know they're in the, it's a nation in the Eastern Caribbean. Do you think there's any potential for some of these smaller states that, were former British possessions or maybe even French or Dutch possessions? Do you think that there's the capacity for these countries to kind of rebuild this West Indies Federation? Do you think the leadership of these islands might kind of come together once again, like how the 13 colonies did in this way, or do you think it's not?
Well, you know, I did my master's degree on Caribbean integration.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ask me, if you put that question a different way, if you'd ask me if it was necessary for them to do that, I'd tell you absolutely.
Okay.
If you ask me if they're going to do it, I'm going to tell you this, that they all recognize they need to. But the problem always is who gives up power first.
Right.
Because to form yourself into a federal situation, you have to agree to give up power.
Right.
You have to have a center, and the center attracts some of the power that you now exercise in international relations, in international bargaining, in the defense of the place, in its security, all of those, even in its money, its currency, how it's administered, all of that has to be, you know, you have common taxation, common customs, you know, the revenue all becomes standardized. Who's going to be prepared to do all of that? When the West Indian Federation broke up, and 2 of the 10 countries left and 8 of the others tried to survive on their own, they broke apart on whether or not one place was willing to allow the revenue from the sale of its stamps to go to the center, rather than to keep it on the island that was producing the stamps. So small things can break down big ideas. Big
Right.
ideals can be shattered by small ambitions. So it'll take, again, what made the 13 states of the United States become the United States of America, a common enemy. Something that is so large and so big that it frightens them, that they cannot manage it on their own. Now, there are already challenges of this kind. Climate change is one of them. They cannot cope with climate change by themselves. They cannot cope with pandemics by themselves, as COVID-19 proved, that you can't cope, world could not cope with COVID-19 by itself, no state in the world, because diseases don't know boundaries. Immigration officers can't stop a pandemic.
Yeah.
No amount of soldiers can stop a pandemic. In fact, all those soldiers become as carriers of the disease.
Right.
So borders after a while become useless in the face of larger problems. And I have to hope that in time, the greater challenges that each of these countries faces individually is going to force them to recognize that the best way to deal with them is collectively. So I think there is a chance. Right now, the Caribbean community and common market survived. It started in 1973, and it is still very much alive 50 years later. So that indicates to you that the countries which belong to that, and there are 15 of them, see good reason why they should at least continue this Caribbean community, albeit a community of sovereign states. But eventually, in time, if they recognize the benefits of it, the institutions of sovereignty will fracture. There will be more power put to the center in their own interests, because they will recognize that to bargain with the United States, or to bargain with China, or to bargain with the European Union, tiny states can't do it alone. But collectively, they have a better chance of bargaining in the international community more effectively. So I think as economic conditions in the world become more difficult, as access to money becomes more expensive, as climate change begins to advance and take greater toll on all of these places, their recognition that they need each other, that interdependence is what is necessary, not independence. We may yet see, at least the English-speaking countries of the Caribbean,
Yeah, that was going to be my next
moving
question.
into a greater unification, with some kind of alignment with countries which are in the Caribbean but are not English-speaking, because language barriers remain language barriers.
Yeah, of course.
And until you overcome that, and that'll take a generation or more of education to do. Then there's transportation. You know, when the empires of the world existed in the Caribbean and in Latin America, in the Americas itself, all of the Americas, we had competing empires. We had France, Spain, and England. And what did they each do? They set up lines of communication to themselves so that transportation, whether it's by air or by sea, was always through. To communicate, for instance, when I went back to the Caribbean in the 1970s, or well, early 1970s, I discovered that I could not send news from Antigua to the island next door in St. Kitts or to Guadeloupe, which was 30 miles away, the French-speaking country.
It had to go back through.
It had to go up to London, from London to France, from France to Guadeloupe.
Yeah, that's
so
ridiculous.
To cover 30 miles, I had to go 5,000 miles to England, and then across the water, the Channel, English Channel, into France, and then back down to Guadeloupe. And that was the means of communication. There were no direct lines of anything. So the alienation of these places as a result of imperial rivalry was so entrenched over such a long period of time. And these links do not exist. We would have to create them.
Yeah, and it just seems like, it was the exploitative nature of the colonial powers at the time. They probably wanted to keep power, to themselves and make sure that if you're going to even talk to the island next door. And it's also, I was thinking about how, the insular nature of islands themselves, it becomes, the 13 colonies might have had a little bit more of a shot, in addition to what you were saying, just being land connected. It's very easy for, someone like me to drive from Massachusetts to New Hampshire to Maine. In the Caribbean, I assume you have a lot of ferries there that transport people.
No, we don't, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Okay. So
the links are by air, not by sea. We don't have a lot of ferries, and such ferries as we have don't ply between all of the connecting islands. They don't connect them. It's only by air that it's connected, and that's becoming increasingly more expensive. And until we can find a way of subsidizing air transport so that it operates much like a bus on a route,
right,
or a train on a route, we're not going to be able to sustain regular air travel in the way in which it is necessary to build communities, not in the way in which it is necessary to sell goods and services.
Yeah.
And I agree with you on the point you make, that the land connection makes that integration easier.
Yeah, this has really been a very eye-opening podcast just for me in general. This is the first one I've done back in the United States since I was in college in Europe. I was there for about 11 months straight until I got back. But we're a little over the time, but that's okay. I don't know if you have any final things you want to say to the audience before we wrap it up, but. Yeah, I think this has been a good one for sure.
No, well, thank you. I mean, I'm delighted to have participated in this with you. I wish you luck with it. I hope that your audience expands, because what you are setting about doing is educating people about things they may not have considered before. And there's no bad aspect of education and information. The more you learn, the better world we'll have at the end of it. So I wish you luck.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for coming on the show.
Okay.
Really appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, guys. Watch out for the next one. Cheers.